Our guest today is Hal Sirkin, Senior Partner at the Boston Consulting Group, and we're going to talk about his research with his colleagues on the revival of manufacturing in the United States. Hal, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here with you, McCool.
So in our last interview for Knowledge at Wharton, which was in February 2012, we had discussed the fact that, although the conventional wisdom was that manufacturing in the U.S. is in long-term decline, that this was increasingly no longer true and that manufacturing had actually begun to return to the U.S. And we also talked about some of the factors that were driving that change. Now, has the trend continued in the past 2 years, and what are some of your most recent findings?
So in 2011, 2012, we said that it wouldn't happen until 2015. I'm glad to say that we were wrong in our projection. That in fact, shortly thereafter, we started seeing company after company after company. Now we can identify 300-400 different companies that have brought back manufacturing to the U.S., not for patriotic reasons, but because it's just good business.
Explain that in some detail. Why does it make good business sense to bring manufacturing back?
Well, if you go back to the late 1990s, you'd see that the labor costs in China were very low. When China entered the WTO in 2001, average labor costs were somewhere around 58 cents an hour. And the U.S. is a very fluid environment for labor. We have the ability to hire and fire, unlike a lot of other developed world countries. And what happened was companies saw that labor was so cheap, they sent the labor out, basically. The manufactured goods were sent to China, they were made in China, and then sent back to the U.S. And that, of course, caused a bunch of hardship in the country. But what goes on in the U.S. is something that is always amazing. We are a truly free market, and we have the ability to make changes, and therefore the economy adjusts. And as Americans, we don't have massive social safety nets. For better or for worse, we just don't have them, and that forces the American economy to adjust. And we adjust and we adapt, and in many ways we survive. Some companies went out of business. Other companies figured out how to stay in business in the U.S. Others outsourced partially and got some of the benefits that way. But what happened is that wages in China, with all the demand for this cheap labor, started going up. And when they're 58 cents an hour, you don't think about it when it becomes $1. But over time, the magic of compounding of 15 to 20% labor rates a year, and you end up in a position where the cost differentials are getting lower.
Now, China has always been sort of the magnet for manufacturing, but in looking at some of your recent research, Mexico seems to be emerging also as a global manufacturing destination. What implications does that have for China?
In 2012, my colleagues and I were quite confused because we were looking at the data and we started to notice that it actually became cheaper to manufacture in Mexico for the kinds of goods that Mexico makes today than it is in China, not even counting the transportation costs. When you have the transportation costs, there's a big difference. And what we've watched now is the maquiladoras, in many ways, from the 1990s in Mexico, packed up in essence, and they became Chinese manufacturing. Now they're coming back, and they are very economic in terms of serving the U.S. As I like to say, it's a 4-day trip to Chicago from Mexico, but it's a 4-month trip from China to Chicago. And therefore, there's a lot of other costs that it's added in there. And so we watched Mexico becoming a very important manufacturing sector. One interesting fact is that there is 4 times as much U.S. content in Mexican-made goods than in Chinese-made goods. So there's actually a lot of reshoring to the U.S. because if you switch a Chinese-made good for a Mexican-made good, you actually get a fair amount of U.S. content.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I was wondering what the emergence of Mexico as a global manufacturing destination means for U.S. manufacturers. Is this something that benefits American manufacturers, or should the U.S. manufacturers be worried about having one more low-cost competitor, but this time closer to their own shores rather than China?
Well, I think it actually makes it better for U.S. manufacturers because they can use the low-cost labor to do the things that you would do with low-cost labor in Mexico today. And therefore, the cost of the total product is lower, and therefore the U.S. can be more competitive with China.
And people often worry about crime and safety and issues like that in Mexico. How are American companies mitigating those risks?
Well, crime and safety are clearly issues, and I think everybody needs to be aware of them. It's probably one of the main reasons that the peso has not increased in value over time because of concerns about this. But what we've seen companies do is they've been able to put in the security systems to do other things that allow them to produce in Mexico with reasonable levels of safety. Obviously, you have to watch what you're doing. It is not like being in a major U.S. city. But it is an issue for companies, and some companies find ways to do it. Others say that the cost differential isn't enough to really do that, and it depends on the product and how companies are looking at the manufacturing situation.
Now, in addition to the rise of Mexico, some of your other recent research also is about pricing of products that are made in America. Do you find that American consumers are willing to pay a price premium for products that are made in the U.S.?
Well, one thing for certain that we know is that American consumers shown a Chinese-made product and a U.S.-made product, even if they're the same exact product, and they're really both made in the U.S., but if they're labeled that way, they will almost always go after the made in USA product. And then what we're also seeing is for a lot of goods, anything that might be health-related, baby care products, many different things that you want to keep for a long period of time, there is a very strong value of made in America versus made in China. And in fact, we did the research in China as well, and 60% of the people in China are looking for made in America products over made in China products. So it is clearly there. And we know the stories. We know the stories of melamine. We know the stories of flights from Australia being loaded up with baby formula and diapers because there's concerns in China. Over time, China will work through these concerns as economies do. But for the time being, there are real concerns with the Chinese consumer, and there are real concerns with the U.S. consumer. And you got to also remember that we're all people who live with our neighbors and our friends and our families. And the reality is, if I buy a made in USA product, I'm actually helping my neighbors, and that's another factor in there. And of course, there's also patriotism. That we are a strong country and we have strong patriotic views.
So are there some product categories that benefit from a Made in America premium and others that don't?
Well, categories that involve children, clearly there. So you want to make sure that the teething blocks and the teething plastics are the kinds of things that you want. And so people look very much on those kinds of products for Made in America. Things that they want to have durable. You want to have hammers and tools and things like that. Those are things that there is a differential in cost, and a lot of consumers have chosen to pay the higher price for Made in America at this point in time, although the cost differential is now getting a lot lower.
Now, your research also found that Chinese consumers are willing to pay more, as you said, for Made in America products, but Europeans are not. And what are the reasons?
Well, I think the difference with the Europeans is that it also has a set of safety standards. Europe is got very similar. We can debate how different they are, but for the most part, they're 99% overlapping. The governments argue on the 1%. So there's really not a real reason for them to do that. And of course, if you're German or French, then you'd be patriotic to that, and you'd be more likely to use that. And of course, if it's made there, in many ways, it could be cheaper.
And if you look at other Asian consumers, are they more like the Europeans or like the Chinese?
Well, it depends on, Asia is a big continent, right? And it very much depends on where you are. If you're in some of the lower wage countries, then there are some real issues, and the population that can afford the American-made goods will buy the American-made goods or the German-made goods or the French-made goods. For the ones in the lower-income countries, of course, that's a different issue. They end up having to basically, buy a cheaper cell phone or a cheaper baby product because that's all they can afford.
I'd like to end with a few questions about what is sometimes called the skills gap crisis.
Sure.
So as manufacturing returns to the U.S., is there truly a crisis of manufacturing-related job skills, or do you think that problem has been overstated?
Well, right now, we really don't have a skills gap or a major skills gap. People working in the natural gas field, that is clearly one where we have it. So things like welders and plumbers are clearly in shortage in the U.S. We've been able to get a lot of that shortage by having imports of people from other countries. But what the big concern is, for example, a welder, the average age of a welder is 58 years old right now. It was basically 57 years a year ago and 56 years old 2 years ago. So we have a fundamental problem coming up here. There are two ways we can solve this problem, one of which is to get better vocational schools and get better training either from a school or from an employer. And as the skills shortage for welders are going to get tougher and tougher, the employers will figure out how to do some of that. The other thing to do is, of course, America is a great place to come. People want to come to this country, whether it's Disneyland or New York City or Philadelphia and all the great cities that we have, and the freedoms that we enjoy here and the luxuries that we have. There are a lot of people who want to come to this country, and we can do it the old-fashioned way as well, which is import people, and we're doing some of that now. But the educational system, particularly for the trade schools, is very important. And I think we need to think about education in a very different way in a country. As you know, I went to the Wharton Business School, and in many ways that was a trade school. I learned a trade, and that trade is business. But at the same time, I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and I got a liberal arts degree at the same time. And I think that made me a more well-rounded person. I don't see why our welders or our plumbers or any other tradesmen wouldn't want to get or couldn't get a two-year degree, in essence, in liberal arts and a two-year degree in their trade. I think that would give them much better job skills and I think a much more satisfying career. Unfortunately, today, our education system doesn't allow that.
Now, are there parts of the country where this problem is more acute than others, and what can be done about that?
Well, it's really where the oil and natural gas is that is really the places where this is acute. We look at North Dakota, where housing prices are higher than apartments in New York City at this point in time, and that's because it's cold up there and it's hard work, but they can make a lot of money. And so we see problems there. The problems will get worse if we don't do something. The natural course will be that we will then start importing people to do this kind of work.
How do you think companies can be more proactive about future skill gaps?
I think it's training. I think it's simple. What happened in the last recession was a lot of companies took out their skills training in order to make quarterly earnings. And that may have been going on for several recessions in the past because what's going on is the U.S. worker has become more efficient, and therefore we need to hire fewer of them for the same level of output. And as I think you know, that in the last 40 years, basically, we've now got 2.5 times as much manufacturing value added, and we do it with 30% less labor. And that's the skills of the U.S. worker and automation and lean manufacturing all taking effect, making the U.S. more productive.
In all the research that you have done over the years over the American manufacturing renaissance, what would you say has surprised you the most?
The speed at which it's taking place. We were thinking it wouldn't take to really even start, that it would be noticeable till 2015. And we underestimated the resilience and the understanding of the business community when they started to look at what they were doing making things in China. A lot of them looked at it and said the economics don't work and decided to start bringing things back. They for a long time, China was the default manufacturing position. And basically, you were crazy if you didn't make everything in China. One major automaker didn't even have a quota for things made in China. They just asked their procurement people to buy just about as much as they could in China because it was going to be cheapest. And they didn't have to do the analysis because it just had to be that way. And of course, it might have been the cheapest if you look at the list price, but you need to look at the whole package. And if the product doesn't have the same quality or if the product has fundamentally different characteristics and can't be as durable, of course, then it's not going to be the same product, and you're probably paying more money than you should be paying.
What are some of the future questions that you plan to research in this area?
Well, we have something coming out very shortly, which is we're now looking at the whole global competitiveness. And so we will be coming out on April 26th with our global competitiveness research. It looks at the top 25 countries and will give people a perspective on how competitive each one of those countries are. And we look at key factors like labor productivity, worker pay, electricity costs, and exchange rates. and we have an index that we can now share, which will be out very shortly. And we're working on some other things on automation as well, which are very interesting. They may be very controversial, so we'll talk about that at another time. At this point in time, we're not exactly sure, but we're still doing the research. But if the research turns out the way it looks like it's going to be another very interesting story that I'd love to share with you, Mikul.
Well, look forward to discussing competitiveness as well as automation with you in the future. Hal, thanks so much for joining
You're welcome.
us today at Knowledge at Wharton. Always a pleasure.
A pleasure, Mikul.